Okay, well, God bless everybody. It's great to see you. Today, the topic is resurrection realizations. The resurrection is one thing, but getting people to believe in the resurrection is totally another. And Jesus' task upon rising from the dead was to get his followers to believe it actually happened. Now, we would think they'd spend a year with him. They would, but they didn't. And it took a lot of hard work that day that he got up to get them to believe that he actually got up. This was no easy task. Jesus once told his disciples that some people are so hard-hearted and hard-headed, so resistant to the truth, that even if someone were going to rise from the dead, they still would not believe. Now, Luke 16:31 says that. But he had to break the disciples out of this mindset. So getting people to believe he rose from the dead was his most important task on that most important day. And 1 Corinthians 15:16 through 20 says, if corpses can't be raised, then Christ wasn't, because he was indeed dead. And if Christ weren't raised, then all you're doing is wandering about in the dark, as lost as ever. It's even worse for those who died hoping in Christ and resurrection, because they're already in their graves. If all we get out of Christ is a little inspiration for a few short years, we're a pretty sorry lot. But the truth is that Christ has been raised up, the first in a long legacy of those who are going to leave the cemeteries. And because Christ was raised from the dead, we too will someday be raised from the dead. Plus, we can do the same works that he did. Now, today we're going to see that the day Jesus rose in his remarkable resurrected body, he appeared 5 different times in 5 different forms to 5 different groups. And we're also going to see that there were 6 resurrection realizations. So we're also going to see that it took 40 days to convince some of his apostles and followers that he was up. So now let's watch how hard Jesus is going to work to help his people grasp their own personal resurrection realization. So now the day Jesus died. The sky was dark and cool, and Jesus had been savagely beaten for many hours, and then had been hanging on that wooden stake for about 6 hours. And through swollen and bloody lips, he belted out his victory song, Psalm 22. And his body then fell limp. And it was over. It was finished. He'd done everything God had asked him to do. Jesus was absolutely sure that he would get up 72 hours, 3 days and 3 nights after he died. And the Bible says that we too will be raised up. But it doesn't give us a time frame. So Jesus died about the same time the Passover lamb was sacrificed in the temple. And that year, he was the Passover sacrifice. And at that very moment that he passed, an earthquake rocked Jerusalem. Freaky. And amazed by the day's events, especially the attitude of this man dubbed as the King of the Jews, the Roman centurion gave Jesus a salutation fit for his divine emperor in Rome. And that's from Mark 15:39. And most of the crowd departed at that point. The show was over. It was time for most people to go home now and eat Passover with their family, have a good little time. It was also time for his disciples to figure out what the heck was going on and what were they going to do next. Imagine a guy that you'd followed around for 1 year and you saw him get beat and killed. What would you feel? What would you think? They had to be thinking, was he actually going to rise from the dead like he said he would? Is it possible? Was he going to wake up from the dead like they'd recently seen Lazarus do? Well, Jesus knew that once he arose, that his resurrection must be realized by the apostles for God's plan to be realized. And this becomes his quest for the next 40 days. The 2 burials. A man named Joseph from the city of Arimathea, a closet disciple of Jesus and a leader in the Sanhedrin, asked Pilate if he could take down and bury the body of Jesus before Passover. And Pilate didn't believe that Jesus was already dead, because people usually last a lot longer than 6 hours on the cross. So he asked the centurion for confirmation, and he concurred. At the centurion's order, the soldiers lifted the post that Jesus was nailed to from its well-used crucifixion hole and lowered it to the ground. Thunk. And they wiggled loose the nails from his hands and his feet and handed over Jesus' body to Joseph as Pilate had instructed. And the soldiers knew that usually the crucified criminals were left for a long time on those wooden posts for intimidation reasons. And their bodies would be picked apart by animals and left to rot and to dry in the sun. But what Pilate wants, Pilate gets. So Joseph and his servants gently moved Jesus' body to an unoccupied, newly excavated tomb that he personally owned. And because Joseph believed Jesus would rise again, he opted to forego the time and cost of a ceremonial cleansing and wrapping in the traditional Jewish burial fashion. He simply wrapped Jesus in an expensive linen sheet, laid him in the tomb with great respect, and had his servants roll a heavy stone back across the entrance. Then he went home. Now Joseph was excited to see what was going to happen in 72 hours. And his men may not have been so optimistic. Well, a few women were watching Joseph bury Jesus. And they noticed that he buried Jesus improperly. And what was he doing? He knows better. And a fellow member of the Sanhedrin, Nicodemus, saw the same thing. He goes, What are you doing, Joseph? And they all thought Joseph was wrong, but he was actually the first one to think right. Now Nicodemus had to work fast because of what he thought was an unbelievably sloppy handling of Jesus' body. And now there was only about 2 hours left before sundown and the Sabbath started, and no work could be done at that point in their religion. Plus, all the stores are going to be closed for 24 hours. He's got to do it now or never. So now I got to rush to clean up Joseph's mess and give proper respect to Jesus. So he had to quickly round up some expensive spices and body wrappings, reopen Joseph's tomb, ceremonially clean Jesus' bloody body, and properly wrap Jesus' body for his second burial. And this all had to be done before sundown. Tick, tock. I guess if there had been clocks, there would have been tick tock. And so the ladies who saw how Joseph buried Jesus were unaware of what Nicodemus had just done because they had gone to go do Passover. So you can sort of see the comedy going on here. John 19:39 says, "And there came also Nicodemus, which at the first came to Jesus by night," that's from John 7:50, "and brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100-pound weight." Now, 100 Roman pounds equate to about 72.5 U.S. pounds. Still, that's a lot of weight. And myrrh and aloes were and still are very, very expensive. Remember how the wise men brought myrrh when they came to see Jesus as a toddler? And Jesus was honored with these pricey spices both at the beginning and the end of his life. Now, a friend of mine who studied forestry told me that aloes is a potent member of the aromatic cedar family. You ever have cedar in your closet or hangers or something? Well, this is like cedar on steroids. And these expensive resins have powerful scents, perfect to help mask the smell of death. John 19:40. "Then they took the body of Jesus and wound it in linen clothes with the spices, as the manner of the Jews is to bury. Now Nick's men, they wrapped the body from neck to toe in these strips of cloth and impregnated with about 72 pounds of this fragrant resin. So it was thick, heavy, and it smelled great. and they respectfully tied a smaller cloth over his battered face, and then they tied that on. Now, verse 41 and 42. Now, in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new sepulchre, wherein was never a man yet laid. And there laid they Jesus, because of the Jews' preparation day, for the sepulchre was nigh at hand. It was close by. And this is when that 72-hour clock started. Jesus was buried twice on the same day. And that day was Wednesday, not Friday, because you can't get 3 days and 3 nights from Friday to Sunday. But that's a whole nother teaching. So far, only one man believed that he would rise from the dead, and that was Joseph. And there had to be more. The disciples, and especially the apostles, must get to the point that they believe that he will rise from the dead. So now, sealing the tomb. Now it's Thursday. It's a religious holiday. It's called Passover. And the chief priests and Pharisees went to see the Roman leader Pilate on this high holy day. And these religious leaders didn't want anybody to steal the body and say, "He is risen from the dead." They still don't want you to believe that he's risen from the dead. Matthew 27:62. Now Matthew 27:63 through 66, saying, "Sir, we remember that this deceiver, this Jesus, said when he was yet alive, 'After 3 days I will rise again.' Command therefore that the sepulchre be made sure until the 3rd day, lest the disciples come by night and steal him away, and say unto the people, He is risen from the dead, so that the last error shall be worse than the first." And Pilate said to them, "You have a watch. Go your way. Make it as sure as you can." So they went and made the sepulchre sure, sealing the stone and setting a watch. The Romans would typically post 4 men on a watch. And these Roman guards found Joseph's tomb, and they sealed a stone with a wax seal, making it illegal to tamper with it. Now, what would happen if you tampered with that and you got caught? You'd probably be crucified. So Pilate still has to play along with those religious troublemakers. Now, Saturday about sundown, send in the angels. Now, not much had happened between his burial on Wednesday afternoon and Saturday afternoon, 72 hours later. There isn't much recorded. But things were about to get busy, really busy. And 3 days had passed. And now it's Saturday, late afternoon or early evening, exactly 72 hours after he had been buried the second time on Wednesday past. And the sepulchral door was rolled closed. Matthew 28, verse 2. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone from the door and sat upon it. His countenance was like lightning, and his raiment white as snow. And for fear of him, the keepers did shake and became as dead men. Now, what a scene. These Roman guards, probably in full battle gear, were sitting there, bored out of their minds, swapping war stories. And they were only there to make sure no one tried to steal the body. And they'd been there for over 2 days, just sitting there, staring at this grave. Now remember, Roman soldiers had to carry with them not just their equipment, but they had to have enough food to last them a few days. So they're always ready for battle, a Roman soldier. And all of a sudden the ground began to shake again, and they see this glowing man streak down from heaven. He then totally disregarded the official seal, and he alone rolled back that heavy stone. And these guys may have seen some crazy things in battle, but this was over the top. In full view of the guards, an angel shoots down from the sky like lightning, rolls this large stone away from the opening like it was nothing, and then just sits on it with a little grin. The guards are speechless. This angel glowed like lightning and was wearing clothing as white as snow. Now this was a little bit too much for these guys to take, so they just fainted. When in doubt, pass out. Now no man and no spirit were going to stop the resurrection. Nothing was going to stop it from going public. Nothing was going to stop it from going viral. And this is Jesus' task now. Nothing in the universe can stop you either as you learn to walk with resurrection power. Just read Philippians 3:10 or Ephesians 1:19 through 20. Then we realize the power of the resurrection, when we realize the power of the resurrection, we too can be and will be unstoppable. It's got to be better, folks. There's got to be something more to being a Christian than just a fancy hairdo. A nice set of clothes or a church you go to. There's got to be. So later that night, the guards had already come to and skulked off to craft their story of a stolen body. And the ladies were unaware of all that had happened since sundown on Saturday. Now they head to the grave in hopes of reburying Jesus properly. They didn't know what Nicodemus had done. They only saw what Joseph had done. And they came back to the gravesite sometime before sunup on Sunday morning. One translation calls it deep dawn. So sometime between dark, when the sun went down and when the sun came up, those ladies went there. It doesn't say when. And these ladies didn't know that Nicodemus had already buried Jesus properly. They just saw what Joseph had shamefully done. And they didn't know the tomb had been officially sealed and had been watched by the Roman soldiers. They also didn't know the stone had been rolled away by an angel and Jesus was already risen from the dead. Were they in for a surprise? Mark 16:1. And when the Sabbath was passed, this is the weekly Sabbath, which is Saturday. It's Friday evening to Saturday evening. When it's passed, now it's early Sunday morning, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome had brought sweet spices that they might come and anoint him. Now the Gospel of Luke adds a fourth name, a woman named Joanna, and also adds certain others. So there was a whole bunch of ladies. And Luke 23:55 that these other women were the ones who recently traveled with Jesus from Galilee down to Jerusalem. There were a bunch of ladies, more than 4, heading out to bury Jesus properly, or so they thought. Mark 16, verse 2. And very early in the morning, the first day of the week, they came unto the sepulchre, at the rising of the sun, or before the rising of the sun. And they said among themselves, who shall roll away the stone from the door of this sepulchre? They didn't know how they were going to move this thing. They're walking to this thing and they realized it took a bunch of guys to roll that thing the first time. They saw Joseph's men. Now they're, sweet little old us, how are we going to do this? They were totally unaware of what had happened the evening before. The guards, the earthquake, the stone, the light, the angel moving at the speed of light, the passing out, the broken wax seal. Oh my word. And the ladies forged ahead anyway, carrying their little bucket of spice and bundle of wrappings. I think if we learned anything from Jesus, I think if they learned anything from Jesus, they learned where there's a will, God will make a way. They knew somehow they were going to be able to perform their task. And I tell you, there's always a way if you have the will. God will make a way where there does not seem to be a way. Sometimes you just have to go for it and believe God will open the doors for you as you move. They won't open before you move. Just like you got to work before you get paid, right? It's the same thing. Mark 16:4. And when they looked, they saw that the stone was rolled away, for it was great. And entering into the sepulchre, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, clothed in a long white garment, and they were affrighted. I love that. They were affrighted. Now, how weird would that be? How weird would it be? You go to this grave, the stone's rolled over, you look in there, and there's a young guy sitting there right next to that cocoon-looking thing of grave wrappings. That had to be a bit freaky. And to him, that angel looked like what? To the women, it looked like what? A young man. And in most Bible records, angels look just like humans, but with cleaner clothes. And no place in the Bible does it say angels have wings, though it does make for some pretty pictures and jewelry. Okay? So Mark 16, verse 4, and he, the angel, saith unto them, be not affrighted. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, which was crucified. He's risen. He's not here. Look, behold the place where they laid him. The young man whom we know is an angel gently taps the hollow grave clothes. And they bend over and look into the empty cocoon of those grave clothes. And their eyes are like, whoa, what the? Now, how crazy would that be? The grave wrappings were still there, 72.5 pounds worth, but it was hollow. How did somebody pull him out of that thing? How did they get him through that little hole without messing up the shoulders of that thing? They still didn't get it yet. Verse 7, but go your way. Tell his disciples and Peter that he goeth before you into Galilee. There shall ye see him, as he said unto you. And they went out quickly and fled from the sepulchre, for they trembled and were amazed. And neither said they anything to any man, for they were afraid. That's a lot to take in. That's a lot to take in. It was still dark outside. The stone was already moved aside. A young man that seemed to be in the know casually is sitting there inside the sepulcher. This guy could have been an angel. They didn't know. He just looked like a young man. And he told them that Jesus was risen up. And then he needs to go tell the guys and tell Peter. And he showed them the hollow grave wrappings in the shape of a body that smelled oh so nice. And these ladies ran like the wind back to the Airbnb, back to the bed and breakfast the men had rented. Now, telling Peter. The women hurried back to tell Peter and the boys about the empty tomb, the hollow grave wrappings, and the young man looking angel thing, telling them that Jesus was missing. But they didn't say he was risen, which I find interesting. They said Jesus is missing. The body's missing. The apostles thought that those emotional ladies, they're just making up another one of their silly lady stories. Oh my. You know, one of those women was the apostle James's mother. James didn't even believe his own mom. Imagine how pissed she would be. Imagine, you ever known something was right and you go and tell somebody and they blow you off? It's a weird thing. It's like, come on, your house on fire. No, I'm just going to watch the show here, you know. And so it's crazy stuff. And Luke 24, 10 and 11, it talks about that. But now back to John 20, verse 2. Then she runneth and cometh to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved, and saith unto them, they have taken away the Lord out of the sepulchre, and we know not where they've laid him. So did she think he'd risen? No. These women didn't yet fully believe their own eyes. Nor did they believe the angel, nor did they believe what Jesus said about himself rising from the dead over and over and over and over. What does it take to believe? What does it take to realize the resurrection actually happened? Verse 3, Peter therefore went forth, and that other disciple, and came to the sepulchre. And so they ran both together. And the other disciple did outrun Peter and came first to the sepulchre. And he, stooping down, looking in, saw the linen clothes lying, that same cocoon-looking thing, yet went he not in. Now, researchers think this other guy was probably either Lazarus or, who's the guy who Jesus had just recently raised from the dead about a week or so before, or it was the Apostle John. I don't know. John 20, verse 6. Then cometh Simon Peter following him, and ran into the sepulchre, and seeth the linen clothes lie. Then the napkin that was about his head, not lying with the linen clothes, but wrapped together in a place by itself. Peter and the other guy ran to the grave. Peter was not as fast. The guy bends over, looks in. Peter runs right past him, steps right into the tomb like the ladies had done. He saw the grave closed, the ointment-covered shell in the shape of a body just laying there empty. Jesus' new body had risen right through the 72 pounds of scented grave wrappings.